Good morning and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for our webinar on MyCP. My name is Monica and I'll be your host for the session. I'm joining you from Houston, Texas. Before we begin, I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. As we get started, please take a moment to ensure your audio and video are working properly. You should be able to see the screen and hear me clearly. In case you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat or Q&A panel, or you can also reach out to us at support@my-cpe.com. Well, we're excited to have attendees from all over the world, so please take a moment to introduce yourself and let us know where you're joining us from. Whether it's a city, state, or a country, you're most welcome to my CPE webinars. Awaiting your responses in the chat panel, everyone. All right, I see New Jersey, New York. Right, I see that many attendees have joined us today, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and supporting our One Credit, One Meal social initiative, through which we donate 1 meal to uninserved for every credit earned. By participating in this webinar, you're making your continuing education more meaningful, and we appreciate your commitment to this cause. Please note that, as per regulations, you're required to remain logged into the session till the end and answer all the polling questions. An evaluation form will be sent to you within the next 24 hours after the completion of this webinar, provided you have answered all the polling questions. Well, this is going to be an interactive webinar, everyone, and we encourage you to ask any questions you have in the chat panel or the Q&A panel. We'll do our best to address them at the end of the webinar if the time permits. If not, then rest assured that you receive the answers via an email within the next 24 to 48 hours. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and without any further ado, let's get started with the presenter, Bruce Conway. Bruce is a seasoned senior advisor in solutions in engineering at Nakisa. With his remarkable 23-year career as chartered professional accountant, Bruce has been a driving force behind pioneering software as a service solutions for global leases. His expertise extends from lease portfolio management to ASC 842 and IFRS 16 compliance, making him a true luminary in the world of financial software implementations. Before gracing the world of equipment leasing and leasing software, Bruce's path was marked by successful roles with industry giants like KPMG and Price Waterhouse. Prepare to be enlightened by his wealth of knowledge and expertise, everyone. So, Bruce, thank you for being with us here today. And without any further ado, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're from. Before I dive into the deck, I'd like to just talk about why I decided on this particular webinar. In my own personal experience, when I've Googled Center of Excellence for large lessees, I've either found something very generic that applies to a Center of Excellence, but not lessees, or in the early days, you would get, data abstraction Center of Excellences. So it would be one specific task, or you would have some managed service outsource providers that would provide more of a salesy type of webinar on outsourcing managed services as a Center of Excellence. So this is not any of those things. This is very much if you are part of a Center of Excellence in a public organization, or you're contemplating a Center of Excellence. What are the challenges, issues that you have? What's working well? What's not working well? I don't think there's really a group that exists that goes through and discusses those sorts of things. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I know that when the standards first started, you would get a lot of senior management attention with regards to a Center of Excellence, setting it up. And one of the comments was, we should be looking at this on an annual basis. My own personal experience is you're not necessarily looking at it on an annual basis. So hopefully this will be the impetus to get that rolling. Also, if you think about whether this applies to equipment or real estate, very often they're so different that these types of webinars aren't appropriate to both. What you're going to find in the Center of Excellence is there's a lot of commonality, and it actually will apply to both. So without further ado, let's get started. So let's start with the basically the agenda for today. So the importance of the Center of Excellence, understanding the data flows, what's a typical composition of a COE? And we're going to evaluate the processes that impact the COE, a few other things, and then Q&A. So the assumption here is that the individuals on this call are not necessarily experts in real estate, not necessarily experts in equipment leasing, but you are knowledgeable enough to know what interactions need to exist between the leasing COE and the various departments. So you know all of the data elements within the leasing process that need to be captured. You know what documentation needs to be captured, maybe what the terms and conditions that exist in the various lease contracts are. You need to have a strong accounting knowledge, but within the COE, you don't necessarily need to be, controller level. There may be controller oversight, but the controller need not be part of the COE. So you would typically own the, completeness and accuracy of the lease accounting subledger, and you're responsible for the disclosures and the auditability of the contracts. But the controller's role should, just be a review and oversight of the COE. And that review obviously would vary, based upon the level of accounting expertise that exists within the COE itself. Generally, you would see a couple of CPAs within the COE, but they need not be, at the controller level. Next slide. So research studies and my observations suggest between 50 and 75% of organizations have a highly centralized COE, depending on the study you look at. About a quarter of organizations are highly decentralized, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And about a quarter or maybe less have shared responsibility between the COE and the different entities or business units. I would have thought that number was a bit higher. Now, it's not always straightforward as to which bucket you fall into, because you have, highly centralized COEs where the business units provide the data and contracts to the COE, but how is that data provided? I can imagine some of you are shaking your heads right about now, and we're going to get into that later. And you can have highly decentralized organizations where the center of excellence is essentially just, it performs as a support organization. But how far does that support go before it starts looking more like a highly centralized center of excellence? And the answer very often has to do with what business process you're looking at. So you may be highly centralized with some business processes within your COE, but highly decentralized with other business processes. So does that make you a highly centralized center of excellence or highly decentralized? I mean, I don't know. So that's why the simple labeling into these different buckets doesn't necessarily mean a lot when you look at some of the research studies. Now, this could possibly be outdated information in light of COVID and improvements in technology, but traditionally, the COE has been centralized in a single location. That is the significant majority of COEs. And when you see organizations that have operations throughout the world, to a significant extent, you're going to see satellite offices. Because if you're going to be, a support organization for the entire company for leasing, you need to have 24/7 support, and that's not going to happen if you're just based in North America. And we've seen in all COEs, in other areas unrelated to leasing, there's obviously cost savings to be had when you outsource to certain countries. We're not going to get into that discussion today because I think you've all heard that debate before, and there's obviously pros and cons associated with that approach. So what a COE typically looks like, based on my experience and based on the research studies that I've seen, if you're talking about large enterprises, you usually only see between 2 and 5 people in the COE. Obviously, there's exceptions, but definitely the significant majority are 5 or less people. So these are not significant COEs, even in very large enterprises. And while there's less research with regards to the specific skill sets within the COE, in my experience, I find that there's typically an even distribution between mid-level and senior level people. So you may have people that are junior and maybe a few more that were mid-level, and a few people that were senior level in typical COE, again, for large enterprises. You won't typically see very junior level people because of the level of complexity associated with leasing, and because most large organizations have fairly sophisticated systems in place. And some of the more manual procedures are no longer required and have already been automated. I would compare it with a fixed asset department as opposed to accounts payable department as far as the typical expertise level. So the reason it's so important to understand what we typically see with large enterprises is because if we are to assume that these large enterprises have done their own business process transformation as a result of the new lease accounting standards, and they've looked at this very carefully, they've come to the conclusion that that's about the right number of people. And that will tell you, just by knowing their skill sets and the number of people, what processes they're typically involved with. So for example, you know that there's no way that 3 or 4 people in a large enterprise can handle all aspects of enterprise lease management. You know there's a significant amount of the leasing process that exists outside the COE. So some of the more obvious examples would be real estate management team. They would not typically be seen as part of the COE. They're more focused on real estate site selection, contract negotiation, et cetera. So there may be some level of involvement we'll get into, but they cannot possibly be responsible for all aspects of that relationship. So is there documentation for the roles and responsibilities? I know at the time of the implementations of the standards, just a little over half of you had a satisfactory strategy in place for your COE, and the rest were working on one or planning to work on one. I don't know today what those stats are, but from what I've seen, there's still a lot of organizations that don't have clearly documented processes and clear areas of responsibility. So if you don't have a RACI matrix, RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And if you don't know what one is, you should Google it. If you don't have one, then there's a strong possibility that you don't have sufficient and appropriate documentation. So these are the 4 generic roles that an individual or COE can play in completing tasks for a business process. So as we discuss some of these business processes in the next half hour, try to think about the RACI that would apply to your organization. We won't have time today to get into those details, but if you don't already have one, you should be leaving this presentation and start the process of working on one. And the most important thing I want to emphasize is that RACIs will change over time as people change, as systems change, as processes change, as the type of leasing that might change. All of those impact the RACI, and it needs to be continually updated for every single business process within the enterprise lease management. If you're not doing this on an annual basis, you may not be realizing some of the cost savings and improvements that can exist. Now, I realize you can say this about any process, but it's even more important in leasing, just given the number of stakeholders that are involved and the complexity associated with the processes and how they impact accounting and tax and procurement and treasury and end users and real estate departments and others. So let's go to the next slide. So reassess outsourcing continually. You should always consider outsourcing certain functions, and we'll touch on that. But the overall assumption is that most of the leasing operations are being conducted internally within your organization. Maybe they're very decentralized in certain areas, and maybe they're centralized in other areas. But every company should, on an annual basis, reevaluate who's doing what and why. So is the decision to outsource or not still the right decision? I'm certainly not opposed to outsourcing a COE. However, I just want to point out some of the potential problems that I've seen with outsourcing rather than insourcing. And one is adaptability. So until you're actually involved on a day-to-day basis performing all the different tasks, it's sometimes difficult to lay out all the roles and responsibilities or the RACI early on. and business environments are constantly changing. And so, it's sometimes difficult when you're outsourcing to third parties to be agile and adaptable. It has a lot to do with communication channels. And I don't want to open up a discussion about remote work or hybrid work, but a lot of the complaints that you're hearing about remote work with individuals not communicating effectively can be even more pronounced with outsourcing leasing services. It's not like outsourcing payroll or fleet management, where you have a very clearly defined objective with a limited number of stakeholders within the company that need to be involved in the process. So maybe that's why we're not seeing most publics go with outsourcing leasing COEs to any great extent. And with leasing, there needs to be communication with so many different departments, as mentioned, so many different reasons that it becomes difficult for the outsourced company to maintain those relationships and keep those lines of communication operating effectively when people are onboarding and exiting both the outsourced COE as well as the company on a regular basis. So again, common to all COEs, but just more prevalent in leasing COEs. And lastly, sometimes those problems can be compounded because the outsourced COE will typically be working with their own leasing solution. And the ability for that leasing solution to have APIs and push and pull data from different departments, different systems within the company is very difficult. Whereas if you have that system internally, it just makes it much easier to communicate between systems. So think of it not just as individuals in the COE communicating with individuals of all the various departments, but also think of it as the systems having to speak with each other effectively. And an enterprise lease management application, that the COE uses needs to effectively communicate to the other company systems. So ERP obviously being one of the main ones, but other possible systems such as AP subledgers, maybe IT asset management systems, maybe fleet management systems, and that becomes much more difficult when you're looking at a leasing application that's used by an outsourced service partner. Okay, so this slide, we're going to start looking at individual lease processes to see if they're good candidates for a COE. And we're going to look at the expertise needed within the COE, and we're going to talk about the interaction between the COE and the various departments and stakeholders, which traditionally has been very much about people interaction, but is obviously moving more and more towards systems integration and managing data and the data analysis and ensuring that the completeness and accuracy of the data. So think about selecting lessors. One question that comes up is the COE involvement with that selection. So this really depends on how large an organization you are. But typically, from what I've seen, the COE is involved in the process, but they're not typically taking a leadership role. So often it's part of the responsibility of treasury, working with procurement or maybe finance. But it's important not to overlook the COE when selecting lessors. There's a lot more to the selection of lessors than pricing. Sometimes it's only the COE that really understands the service levels or lack thereof that the lessors have provided on their previous financing. So that can be extremely important, not just from a cost perspective and the administrative cost dealing with poor service levels, but also you come across situations where you're simply not getting the data you need to make informed decisions and to really understand what your lessors are earning. So I don't want to get too deep into this discussion of selecting lessors, but there are different terms and conditions, such as restrictive end of term conditions, excessive purchase option prices, that the COE individuals have a much better grasp of than other departments because they're involved in those transactions on a day-to-day basis. They're hearing the complaints from their own internal end users on a day-to-day basis that somebody that's higher up in treasury or procurement is not hearing about because they're not as directly involved in the day-to-day activities or interaction with those lessors. I've also seen situations where the primary person for selecting the lessor is in fact within the COE. This tends to be the case only for very large organizations. And in that situation, that individual still needs to draw heavily from the expertise of those in treasury, procurement, and finance. So in a subsequent business process, I suggest where typically the function resides, but it very much depends on your specific situation. So where does it logically fit? Is there cost justification for putting an individual with these skill sets within the COE? Or can you just utilize the individuals with specific expertise within different functional departments? It really depends on your size and complexity in your leasing portfolio. It can go both ways. Lease versus buy. This is where I see the greatest level of variability that exists within COEs. There's really like no commonality. So sometimes the COE simply does not get involved at all until the lease contract's fully executed. Other times they're involved from the very beginning. They're not procurement experts. They don't necessarily understand the type of real estate or equipment that's needed, and they don't know how long it's needed for. So they're not involved in any of those processes. However, they do need to make sure that the financing source is lined up in the event that it's leased instead of purchased. And they need to make sure that the decision to lease over purchase is systematized. So what am I talking about here? So think of a lease versus buy analysis. Think of all the variables that go into a lease versus buy. You have the weighted average cost of capital rates that are coming from Treasury. You have tax depreciation rates for the purpose of tax savings in your cash flows that are incorporated into lease versus buy. And those are coming from your tax department. So within the COE, you're not a Treasury expert. You're not a tax expert. You're not a finance expert. You're not a procurement expert, but you know enough about a lease versus buy to understand what data components are needed from each of those departments. You know enough about the various systems that exist within each of those departments. Where can the data be extracted from in hopefully an automated manner, And you also realize that the individual who's procuring that real estate or that equipment in the business units is typically not knowledgeable enough to provide all that data. So that is often just not critical to their decision making. So what are the skill sets that are required from the COE in order to coordinate that effort? Well, you need somebody who really understands all the data that goes into the LVB and where to get that data from. You need to have a good enough understanding of the systems and integrations to push automation in those areas. So for example, whether you're talking about creating an Excel file with IVR rates and tax rates and useful lives for tax depreciation, or whether you're talking about assisting in the creation of APIs into the treasury systems or tax management systems for more sophisticated enterprises, the key is that you need to understand what is needed and how to get that information in the most efficient manner. And you need to understand when a lease versus buy is necessary and when it's not necessary. So if a company has determined that if you have a policy where they're going to lease all vehicles, then the COE should be accepting documentation for vehicles without a lease versus buy. If, however, the asset category requires a lease versus buy for every lease, then that needs to be built into the documentation requirements. That's an area where the COE would be responsible for creating that policy with multiple departments and enforcing that policy within the COE. So unfortunately, sometimes you see multiple versions of a lease versus buy that have different assumptions built into them. Some are current, some are not current, with the most recent information on weighted average cost of capital or tax rates. And you have no consistency throughout the organization. So that's a pretty good indication that you need a COE that's going to coordinate, a single model to be used throughout the organization. So the COE would be responsible for those updates. So you're always working from the same consistent model. So if you're encountering some of those issues within your organization, maybe that's an example of an area that you should consider centralizing to your COE. Now, lease contracts. Again, the COE involvement with lease contracts varies greatly. I typically see very little involvement when it comes to real estate. Large organizations have a real estate team, and given the level of complexity in those contracts, those real estate teams tend to handle pretty much everything themselves, and there's very little involvement in contracting from the COE. It's different when it comes to equipment, because if you have equipment leases being created throughout the organization, in different countries or divisions, there's often a need to have that process centralized. So instead of having 20 different people dealing with a lessor, you have a single individual dealing with a lessor, just to get economies of scale and best lease pricing. And a COE will ensure completeness and consistency in the documentation. Now, you don't have people in a COE typically signing a certificate of acceptance. Obviously, that would be done at the location level. But you do have the COE being the coordinator of documentation, and they'll generally need to sign off on these contracts, or at least be one of the individuals requiring sign off. I remember on several occasions when the new lease accounting standard started, a lot of companies were complaining that it was difficult to even find the contracts and enter into their system. So that prompted, a lot of companies to move towards centralization within a COE, just to ensure that all the lease documents were captured in a central repository and nothing goes missing. And they've continued with that approach on an ongoing basis. And they're not going to enter it into their systems until they ensure that documentation has been completed. So if it's not in their systems, then the lessor is not getting paid. That's essentially the control for completeness and accuracy of documentation. If the documentation does not exist within the COE, then the lessor does not get paid. Okay, portfolio management. Okay, so we've been through the origination, the lease versus buy, the contracting, all of which we've seen different approaches. Now we're getting into areas where there's more consistency among companies, and that gets into the area of lease administration, lease accounting, financial reporting. This is where the COE is almost always advantageous, and centralization is, typically the preferable route. And this is typically the core function of the COE. So you're probably getting tired of looking at this slide. I probably should have moved to this slide a little earlier. So let's start with booking. So why would booking and all portfolio management? Sorry, give me 1 second. So is this the right slide? Yep, it is. Why would they typically be within the COE? Well, if you think of all the data that's required to be captured within your subledger, within your leasing subledger, it takes a certain amount of skill and focus in understanding the subledger, understanding all the data that's required for accurate financial reporting, for compliance purposes, and for operational decision making. So you're not going to get that level of understanding of the required data from decentralized division. That's not to say that the only people using the leasing subledger are the COE. What I am saying is that the lease administrators are the ones who are really deep within the system and understand the system and the required data. So additional stakeholders may be involved in reviewing and approving, through workflow, where they're logging in, approving, logging out. Or they may be involved in, by testing as to whether an option is reasonably certain or not. Or they may be responsible to upload certain information such as IBRs, incremental borrowing rates, or FX, foreign exchange rates. But it's the COE that's actually entering the master lease agreements, the contracts, the asset level data associated with the contract. And they're responsible for the most efficient and automated way to get that data into their subledger. And often they're responsible for performing the reconciliations between the contracts and the contract data, or reconciliations between the subledger and the general ledger. And for that, you need to understand the subledger and the reporting available. That typically resides within the COE. If that's not your situation, you need to ask yourself the question why it's not. Could it be better handled through a COE? So even though you may not you might not have control over the GL or the ERP, you can still exert control over what goes into it, and which accounts are locked. So you should be able to own the reconciliation between the subledger and the GL. I've seen that allocated to the business units with the COE as support, but that tends to be more difficult if it's decentralized, because you have so many different types of reconciliations, which introduces inefficiencies. Changes, modifications, returns, buyouts. Everything I just said for booking deals would apply equally to day two events. So this could be an hour discussion. So if you're interested in exploring this further with me, please don't hesitate to give me a call. This can get pretty complex, and it's why the process needs to be managed by the COE with a subledger and automation. Now, not on this slide, just want to comment briefly. We don't have time to get into all the ways that systems can be used by multiple stakeholders throughout the organization. However, I will say that another role the COE plays is to essentially be a support center for those users throughout the organization that are using the system for specific tasks. So, for example, the COE would first of all be responsible for creating new users within the system and revoking access, all in accordance with company policy. And there should be a ticketing system where infrequent users of the system can submit tickets that will flow through to the COE, where the expert users within the COE can respond to those tickets. So I see a lot of that as well. And then if it's something to do with the system itself, those expert users would submit tickets to the actual software vendor. Okay, so this is a summary of some of the tasks the COE is involved with throughout the month and month end. Okay, so additional systems. So as mentioned, the COE needs to understand the most efficient way to get data into the subledger, the lease accounting subledger, and reporting out to meet the needs of users. So therefore, they need a reasonable understanding of these additional systems that may not be part of your core leasing subledger or ERP. So real estate systems and accounts payable systems are the most obvious, hopefully fully integrated with your lease accounting subledger, where you need to understand the data flows or APIs in and out. Fixed assets, where maybe you're buying out a lot of your leases and they need to be transferred to your fixed asset subledger. If you have a fleet service provider or fleet systems, how do you get that data into your subledger without redundant data entry? Same thing for ITAMs, for IT asset management systems. Maybe even flows into your tax management systems to assist with deferred income tax entries. So you should be thinking about not just your lease accounting subledger, not just your ERP, you should be thinking about all of these things. I don't know if you've been following what's coming with Microsoft Copilot in the next few months and the various ways that AI and large language models are going to be incorporated into your day-to-day business processes. But it's something that you should definitely be thinking about in your COE. My earlier discussion on RACEs and looking at the individual business processes that are going through change based upon the level of automation that's coming down the road needs to be looked at. So as an example, I saw a video the other day on OneDrive version 3 that's coming out along with Copilot for all the other Microsoft apps. And there's capabilities that I can see really changing the way teams communicate with each other. And given one of the most important roles of the COE is to improve the lines of communication between the different departments, the different stakeholders throughout the organization, then that's an area where they can really take that new technology and help improve those communications. Now, again, I realize this can be said about any function within a business, but given the interaction the COE has on a daily basis with so many different departments, it just makes it that much more important. And you can use all those new technologies for communications, along with an enterprise lease management software, which hopefully adapts to those changes in technology. Hopefully they have a microservice architecture and APIs that can take advantage of all of these. things that are coming out. So yes, some of the more administrative tasks will disappear, but that doesn't mean people's jobs in the COE will disappear. What it means is that those people in the COE, instead of focusing on things like month-end reconciliations and analyzing anomalies or fluctuations or resolving discrepancies, you'll be more focused on how can you help your organization save money by realizing the economic benefits of leasing. So as an example, better identify where you have excessive evergreen or month-to-month spending for specific departments or users, or maybe assisting in creating bots that give you better intelligence to be able to effectively negotiate at the end of your lease term with your lessors. So understanding better what their rate of return is when you're negotiating a buyout or negotiating extensions. I would say most centers of excellence today are really just focused on pure accounting compliance and making sure that all the data in the systems is complete and accurate. And that is a huge effort in and of itself. But I do see that changing over time, as technology of both the lease accounting subledgers get stronger, but also the related tools like Copilot get stronger. I would also, next slide is, I would also definitely recommend the COE established as a central repository of your standard types of lease contracts in import files. So hopefully your solution has import capability. Otherwise, you should think about getting another solution. So you can use the library for training or onboarding of new team members, and you can use it to validate new software releases. I think it's an integral part of your overall documentation. Different departments, different users can have their own unique portion of that library. Maybe they can use as templates with example data to be deleted and replaced with real data and then used in your production environment. So, have a look at the slide when you get a chance. So I want to leave time for some Q&A and not run out of times. We're ready for the final polling question and then the Q&A. Before we do that, a quick word about the company that I work for. Nakisa Lease Administration software streamlines and simplifies lease management and lease accounting operations while enabling compliance. Robust accounting capabilities covering complex use cases. Knowledge team of technical experts, 24/7 support. That would be me and other people. I'm one of them. Complete and accurate IFRS 16, ASC 842 disclosure reports, ERP integration, very important, SAP Oracle with option for disconnected modes. Lots more to say about our software, or if you just want to chat further about your own COE experience, please feel free to reach out with me and I'd be happy to talk. And I would love it if some sort of, group started where you guys could start sharing your own experiences with each other. So validate some of the things that I've said or give me examples of where, completely different scenarios. That would be great. So we're going to move on.
I have a question in the Q&A panel. It says, how many companies have you met that fully outsource the lease accounting function?
Fully outsource the lease accounting function. So I'm literally hearing the word fully. And as I discussed early on, that is rare. It's very, very rare that you would have a full outsourcing of your COE, given all of the tasks simply that a COE has. Now, if you define the COE to be just lease accounting, lease administration, you might see 10% of large publics that might consider that outsourcing. But if you're talking about the full aspect of leasing A to Z, it's extremely rare that you ordinarily see outsourcing of specific tasks. So earlier I had mentioned data abstraction, from lease contracts. That's a good example of where you would outsource just a part of the process, not fully. So hopefully that answers the question. Please share the results visually. So hopefully, I'm not sure how we can do that. So hopefully what we'll do is we'll get the
yes, Bruce, I have it is about the polling questions. So when we ended the polling question, I shared the results already. So that was taken care of.
perfect. Okay.
And in the Q&A panel, we do have another question. If you have access to the Q&A panel, or do you want me to read the question again?
I'm sorry, do you mind reading the question? I don't, oh, I see with QA pen. I told you I wasn't familiar with Zoom. There we go.
No worries at all.
I got it. How many companies? Okay. After integrating the lease accounting subledger to the general ledger, what is the second most common system that you see being connected to the lease accounting subledger? So that's a really good question. It's definitely either the real estate systems or the AP module. I guess I would have to say the real estate would come in first, and the accounts payable would come in second. I have another question here. How can the COE be responsible for areas of the leasing process that they don't have control over or access to systems? So I guess that's other slide that I was showing. So that's a great question. It really depends. But let me give you a couple of examples of what I think you're talking about. Let's say you have a fleet management system, but that fleet management system is administered by a third party. Or you have a lot of real estate leases, but those real estate leases are handled by a third party like JLL or CBRE. Or maybe you have an IT asset management system that has all the data associated with your leased IT assets. So how can you take ownership of the data that resides in those systems? Well, the answer is that you don't. Your responsibility is not the completeness and accuracy of those systems. Your responsibility is the completeness and accuracy of the accounting information that gets pushed into your lease accounting subledger. But all the other data, that might be of significance for real estate department or IT department, your fleet, if it's not of a financial nature, then it's not your responsibility. So your responsibility is understanding which data elements need to flow between those systems and your lease accounting subledger. So hopefully that answers that question. I don't see any other questions. We are 11:53. We can consider giving people some time back, or, oh, one just popped up. If I have a brand new person that does now know anything, I guess he means that does not know anything about lease accounting, are there courses you recommend we could share? This is outside of any software, just a place to learn about technical accounting. God, that's a great question. And I used to be able to answer it, used to have all of these great resources. I would say now things have changed. There's so much on YouTube. And first of all, what I would do, though, if you're doing searches on YouTube, is think about what it is you want to learn. So if you're in the US, there's a lot of stuff on IFRS 16 you don't want to be necessarily looking at. First, you want to look at ASC 842. If you're outside the US, you should be focusing primarily on IFRS 16. I mean, depending on the country. And they usually say in those YouTube courses, whether they're beginning courses or not. So if you're the sort of person that just likes to sit back on your couch and see videos, I would say that's the best resource. Other than that, give me a call and maybe I can ask some of the staff here if there's any like online accounting 101 courses that they recommend. I haven't looked at that for a while. So I think, okay, I think we're done. Well, thank you for that comment. I I really appreciate everybody attending today. And you have my email on screen here. Would love to hear from you and your own experiences. And again, maybe even get something started, even if I connect you with another COE that has similar or like issues. So have a great day, everybody. And I appreciate again you attending the session.
All
Do
right.
we have a,
No,
yeah, go ahead. Yep.
see that we do not have any questions, so I guess let's go to wrap up the session. And Mashid and Bruce, do you have any last words before we end up or wrap up the session?
Nope, just thanks again.
Perfect. All
Have a
right.
great day, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on MyCP. I hope you found the session informative, valuable, and engaging. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our presenter, Bruce, for sharing his expertise and insights with us. Thank you so much, Bruce, for this wonderful session again.
Thank you.
One more important thing, everyone. To obtain your credit certificate, you receive an evaluation form within the next 24 hours after the completion of this webinar, provided you have answered all the polling questions. If you have any further questions or need to view the recording, feel free to email us at support@my-cpe.com. Once again, thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience. We appreciate your participation and hope you'll join us again for our future webinars. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Stay safe and stay healthy. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Mesha. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.